And we're here now on the top of Daf Ayin Testament Beis, and we're studying the Lishna Basra of Rav Kahana. And according to this Lishna Basra, the case of Mechza Mechza, the Mechza of Tmeim, will not be included neither in Pesach Rishon nor in Pesach Sheni. And the Gemara explains on the second one. Berishon lo avdi. They certainly cannot participate in the first Pesach because that Pesach is only brought betuma. A Pesach could only be brought betuma if you have rov tmeim. Rav Kahana says that if it's mechzal mechzas, you only have 50% of the kol at tmeim. Therefore, there's no justification to bring the carbon betuma. So as far as Pesach Rishon is concerned, that's clear. And that's true in both Lashonos of Rav Kahana. He doesn't hold like Rav, who says that this mechza tmeim make themselves into, or upgrade into a community of themselves to bring Pesach Rishon betuma. They don't have a role. No, let them bring Pesach Sheni instead of Pesach Rishon. So the Gemara says, "B'sheni lo avdi to lo have miyuta." We have a principle that Pesach Sheni is applicable only to a mute, and in the case of Mechtal Mechza, where 50 are Tmeim, we don't have a mute, and if there's no mute, they cannot be pushed off to Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara asks from our Mishnah a kash on Rav. Tanan, it says in our Mishnah, Nitma kol o rubo o shayu kohanim tmeim vakol tahorim yasa betuma. The Mishnah says that when do we bring the carbon pesach betuma? That's only because rov of the tzibur are tmeim. So the Gemara is medayek rubo hudi avdi betuma. When does the Mishnah allow bringing the carbon betuma? That's only when you have rov kol. Aval palgal pag. The implication is if only half the tzibur tmeim, lo avdi b'rishon, we cannot bring the carbon on Pesach Rishon. It's only because there's a rov. Is kashal Rav. Rav responds, Ruba avdi kulo bituma palga halolu otzim liatzman velolu otzim liatzman. Rav says that you know why the Mishnah mentions rov to the exclusion of mechzal mechza, because the Mishnah wants to say that because you have rov and the tmeim jump on board and they'll also participate in Pesach Rishon, to the exclusion of palgal palga, where it's not so. We're not going to bring the carbon betuma for the entire community of Israel. For that, we need rov tmeim, and that's why the Mishnah emphasizes rov. If it's ruba, then the entire community gathers around the flag of Korban Pesach Shabbat Betuma. Ahorim will also join in this Korban Pesach Betuma because it's Rov Tmeim. But if there's Mechzal Mechza, we're not going to bring a Korban Betuma. We don't have a community at Tzibur that's a clear-cut Tzibur that's Tmeim and justifies the Korban Tzibur, the Betuma. So therefore, let the Tahorim bring their own carbon. They're mechza, they have a quasi status of a tzibur that justifies them bringing the carbon bitara, and the tmeim are also a quasi community like a rov, and they will bring the carbon bitum. And that's what the Mishnah is coming to exclude. Now the Gemara makes an about face and actually reads the Sefer of the Mishnah to prove Rav Shita. Ochinam mistabra, the Ketani Sefer, nitma miut hakol, Ahoru, Osimus Rishon, Tmeim Osimus Hasheni. So the Mishnah is very careful. It says that only if the Tmeim are in the miut, in that case, the Tmeim are pushed off to Pesach Sheni. Miut who the Avdi B'Sheni. Aval Palgu lo. The Avdi B'Rishon. The implication of the Mishnah is clearly in support of Rav, that had it been Palgal Palga, we would not push off the Tmeim to Pesach Sheni. The only reason we pushed off the Tmeim Pesach Sheni is because they were the miut in the kol. Had they been Palga, we would not push them off to Pesach Sheni. So now Rav asks himself, so what do we do in this case? We don't have a rov tmeim. So hatahorim osim liatzma and vatmeim osim liatzma. The Ela Kashil Rav Kahana. You've made such a great argument in support of Rav from the Sefer. Now we have to figure out how Rav Kahana is going to deal with the Sefer. Rav Kahana says that you don't have a justification to make this digduk and diuk from the Sefer. The Metzal Mechza, the Tmeim can be invited to the first carbon, meaning on Yudalad B'Nisan. But rather, here's the way you should be medayik in the Mishnah. Nitmu miut hakol. If the tmeim are only in the miut, is tahorim osim es harishon, utmeim osim es hasheni. Only in a case where the tmeim are a miut, then we push them off to Pesach Sheni. Upalga, the deed from the Mishnah is that had it been a case of palga, this is the way Rav Kahana in the Lishna Basra would interpret our Mishnah. Because Rav Kahana in the Lishna Basra went as far as to say that in the case of Palga, the Tmeim are not a rov, they only have 50. Therefore, we cannot justify a carbon above Betuma. So the Tmeim are not part of Pesach Rishon. But on the other hand, they're not part of Pesach Sheni as well because they are not a mute. You cannot disqualify them as a mute and call them each an amalgamation of individuals that are sent to Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara asks, Teinach Lishna Basra, that makes sense according to the second Lishna in Rav Kahana, that in the case of Mechza, the Tmeim are not part of Pesach Rishon nor Pesach Sheni. Elahach Lishna, the Omer Rav Kahana. What about the first lishon of Rav Kahana? Tahorim osim esarishon tmeim osim sheni ma'ikol and meimar. How are you going to be explain the diuk of the Mishnah that we would die from the Mishnah that mechzal mechza the tmeim don't bring the carbon, neither the rishon nor the sheni. How are you going to defend the first lishon of Rav Kahana? Omer lecha Rav Kahana, who did dafilu palgal nami tahorim osim esarishon. Utmeim osim es hasheni. In other words, Rav Kahana is telling us that according to the Mishnah, if you have less than rov tmeim, you only have 50% of the tmeim. Then, since it's not a rov, then they are individuals automatically. In the absence of a rov, you become yechidim, and then we push you off to Pesach Sheni. Ahaydik tani miut kahol. The only reason why the Mishnah mentions in the Sefer miut kol is either the Tani Reisha, Tani Sefer. In the Reisha it says Rubo, because Mechzal Mechza, the din is different. And Tani Nami Sefer use the word miuto in the Sefer to contrast with the Reisha of Rubo. Tani Kavosi the Rav, Tani Kavosi the Rav Kana, Ukitre Lichne. We're going to bring three different brises. Tani Kavosi the Rav. One brisa explicitly formulates Ra, and it says, "Hoyisot mechzal mechza Torah mechza tmeim, halolo osim liatzma, halolo osim liatzma." That's exactly Rav Shita. Tanya Kalishna Kama the Rav Kahana, that if the mechza tmeim cannot participate in the first carbon, we'll push them off to the second carbon. Haresha Yisrael mechzal Torah mechza tmeim, Torah osim mechza rishon tmeim osim l'sheni. But Tanya Kavose, the Lishna Basra, the Rav Kahana, that the Mechzal Mechza case, the Tmeim are not included neither in Pesach Rishon nor in Pesach Sheni. Hareisha HaYisrael Mechza Tahorim Mechza Tmeim Tahorim also Rishon Tmeim Eino Osim Los HaRishon Los HaSheni. Honestly, Rabbi said at this point, I would be very happy. I would say Tam V'Nishlam. Okay, you have three brises, and you have three possible shitas. You have Rav and two shitas of Rav Kahana. Fine. The Gemara is not happy. The Gemara wants to work out each one of the three brises according to each one of the three shitas to reconcile all the brises with all the shitas. And that's going to be this undertaking here for pretty much the rest of today's daf. Lirav, according to Rav, who holds that mechzal mechza is the tmeim will be part of the Korban Pesach Rishon. They'll have their own Korban Pesach. And the Lishna Basra de Rav Kahana, that the Tmeim did not have any Pesach at all, not Berishon, not B'Sheni. Ha What do we do with the Brisa that says Tohorim Osam Rishon? Utmeim es Hasheni. That's explicitly like Rav Kahana in the Lishna Kama. So it's stuck with Rav, who holds that the Tmeim are participants in Pesach Rishon. That's against this Brisa. And we're stuck with Rav Kahana in the Lishna Basar of Kahana because he says that Tmeim are not part of Pesach Sheni because since they are not a miut, they're 50%, so we cannot push them off to Pesach Sheni. And now the Gemara is going to explain this Brisa according to Rav, and then according to Rav Kahana in the Lishna Basar. So first, Kigon Shahoy Yisrael Mechzet Torah Mechzet Tmeim V'Noshim Mashlimos L'Tmeim. In other words, it works like this. You've got 50% Tahorim, and the other 50% are an addition of A plus B. They are the Noshim and the Anoshim. So when you add the number of women to the number of men who are Tmeim, you get 50% Tmeim. Kosovar, the Tana of this Brisa holds, Noshim Pesach Rishon Rishus. So those are words that we should underline because when we get to Daf Tzadi Aleph, another 12 blot, the Gemara quotes a machlokes where the Noshim are obligated in Korban Pesach. Rabbi Yehuda holds they are obligated, but they are exempt from Pesach Sheni in the event that they couldn't participate in Pesach Rishon. Rabbi Yossi holds that they're obligated both in Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Rabbi Shimon holds they're parted from both Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, and therefore their status is only equal to that of a Rishus. And we'll see if we can compare Rab Shimon to what's called the Mitzvah Seishas Man Grama, where Nashim Rishus, they have the option, but they're not obligated. Anyway, our Brisa, the Gemara says, holds that Nashim, as far as Pesach Rishon is concerned, are a Rishus. There's no Chiyuv. And therefore, we cannot calculate them as part of the Tmeim in the Torah. Now, Dal Noshim, since women are not obligated to Pesach, we have to exclude them, drop them from the numbers, make Tmeim, so they cannot bolster up the number of Tmeim to make it into a Mechza. Havile Tmeim Miuta. So what we're left with is a minority of Tmeim. So you might have 50 Tahorim, 25 Tmeim, and 25 women who are Tmeim, but that's irrelevant because they're Shus. So we have 50 Tahorim against 25 Tmeim. Is Miuta Yitchul Pesach Sheni? No one has any compunctions, not even Rav Kahana in the second Lishna, that Yechidim have to be pushed off to the second Pesach. The only time that Rav Kahana in Lishna Basra said that they're excluded even from Pesach Sheni, that was only because they were 50. But now they're 25. And as far as Rav is concerned, the reason why Rav said vehalol, meaning the Tmeim osim li'atzman, is because they were 50, but now they're in the minority, and therefore they cannot participate in Pesach Rishon, and as a minority, they get pushed off to Pesach Sheni. Okay, now the Gemara continues and tries to figure out how Rav and the Lishna Kama of Rav Kahana are going to explain the next brisa. Le Rav, who holds a Mechzal Mechta, is Tmei Mosim Barishon, and Le Lishna Kama de Rav Kahana, who says that the Tmeim are Osam B'Sheni, Hadasani, what do we do with the following Bryce? Says that Tahorim Osam is a Rishon. Utmeim Einam Osam is a Rishon, V'Lotzat Sheni Echem Tzalei. And that Bryce is clear-cut evidence to Rav Kahana in the Lishna Basra. Just rewriting Rav Kahana in the Lishna Basra. That the Tahorim bring it in Pesach Rishon, and the Tmeim are excluded from both Rishon and Sheni. So our answer is, now here at this point, we need two different answers. We need Rav's answer, and we need an answer to defend the first Lishna of Rav Kahana. Rav Mitaritzle, Kigon Shahal Yisrael, Mechza Tmeim, Mechza Tahorim. Okay, now, we have 50 Zecharim, 50 males who are Tahorim, and we have 50 males who are Tmei. Now add the Noshim. The Noshim in this case, in this scenario, are Tahoros. Is Odfos al Tahorim. They are added to bolster the number 50 of Tahorim, which would now mean that we have a majority of Tahorim. Is Kasavar, this brisa is of the opinion that Noshim and Pesach Rishon Chova, like the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, actually. So if Noshim, the Pesach Rishon Chova, they could be mitzaref, and we count them and calculate them together with the 50 Tahorim and tip the scale and establish a majority of Tahorim. And therefore, clearly, the Tahorim will bring the Pesach Rishon. However, although the Noshim are mitzaref to Pesach Rishon, because they're obligated in Pesach Rishon, but we're going to go now like Rabbi Yehuda on Daf Tzadi Aleph, that women are obligated in Pesach Rishon, but not in Pesach Sheni, an event they couldn't bring Pesach Rishon. But Pesach Sheni, Rishus. We'll allow them to bring the Pesach Sheni if they couldn't, but they're not obligated. Is therefore the Tmeim, B'Rishon Lo Avdi, they could not possibly participate in the Pesach Rishon because they are in the miut. Now, why not give them the option of Pesach Sheni? Miut lo avdi b'rishon. Ub'sheni lo avdi. Why? Because now, since Noshim and Pesach Sheni Rishus, we cannot calculate the Noshim, Tahoros in this case, in the number in order to get a rove. So what we now have is Dal Noshim Inayu, Havile Palga Upalga. So now we're left with 50-50. Because you remember, we started with 50-50. We only added to the Tahorim by adding the Noshim, the women folk. But now in Pesach Sheni, because Rabbi Yehuda holds a Pesach Sheni Noshim Turos, it's only Rishus, therefore they cannot be calculated in Pesach Sheni. So we're left with Palgal Palga as far as Pesach Sheni is concerned. Upalga lo avdi b'sheni. Rav holds that if you have half the community, you cannot push up half the community to Pesach Sheni. And that's based on a principle later on in the Gemara Daf Pei called Rov Tzibur Einam Osim Pesach Sheni. We can never give a rove of the Tzibur a Pesach Sheni. Pesach Sheni is only an option for a minority of the Tzibur, Ish, but not for the majority. Now, keep in mind, a Rav sheet is that Mechza is Kirov. So it's as if you have rove. It's as if you have Rov Tmeim. So Rov Tmeim becomes a tzibur of themselves, and we never push off a tzibur to Pesach Sheni. Is therefore lo avdi b'sheni. Just 1 second. Okay. Now that will satisfy Rav, but we still have Rav Kahana in the first Lishna, the Omar, he's of the opinion that Palganami Avdi, that in the case of Mechtal Mechta, we push off the Tmeim to Pesach Sheni. So this explanation of the Brisa to justify why the Tmeim in this case are excluded even from Pesach Sheni, that's not going to work for Rav Kahana because he holds that Mechta is not considered a Tzibur, Eino Karov, and they will bring the Korban Pesach Sheni. So what are we going to do with this Brisa, the Palganami Avdi B'Sheni? Hachi Metaritz. Here's the way Rav Kahana in the Lishna Kama is going to answer up this Brisa. Kigon, Shahoy Yisrael Mechta Torim Mechta Tmeim. V'noshim Ashlimos L'Tohorim. In other words, the male members of the community that were Tmeim were the Rov, and the male members of the community that were Tahorim were the Miut. And we're going to add the Nashim, if you hold Nashim in Pesach Rishon Chova, like Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, and add that to bolster up the Tahorim. And now we tip the scale, the Rov becomes the Rov Tahorim. Just 1 second. Mashlimos the Torah. No, I'm sorry. Initially, we had, let's say, we had 50 Tmeim and 40 Tahorim. That's without the women folk. Now we'll add 20 women folk who are Tahorim, and now we have 60 Tahorim and 40 Tmeim, and against 50 Tmeim. So what happens now? Because Savar Nashim B'Rishon Chova. Ubisheni Rishus, holding like Rabbi Yehuda, that Nashim B'Korban Pesach Sheni are Rishus. Is B'Rishon Lo Avdi, the Tmeim cannot possibly bring a Korban B'Rishon Avile. Palga Upalga, because we had only 40 Tahorim without the women. And now we add, let's say we add another 10 women. I said 20. Let's say 10. Let's say we add another 10 women to a Torah. So we have Palga. And in such a case, Berishon, right, because Rav Kahana holds that Palga is not a rov. And if Palga is not a rov, you cannot justify a Korban B'Tumah for the Tmeim. Palga Rishon Lo Avdi. Oh, now why does the Brayse say B'Sheni Nami Lo Avdi? Because we're holding B'Sheni Rishus, that the women are not part of the calculation with regard to Pesach Sheni. Why? So Dal Noshim Inayim in Tahorim. So we have to remove those extra 10 for the women, as far as Pesach Sheni is concerned, even though they're Torah. And there's no Chiv Pesach Sheni. Why? Because Havale Tmeim Ruba Veruba Lo Avdi B'Sheni. Right? So if you don't add the extra 10 to balance it out, 50-50, so you're left with 50 Tmeim and 40 Tahorim. In such a case, you don't have a possibility of Pesach Sheni because the principle is Ruba the Pesach Sheni Lo Avdi. Now the Gemara says, how are we going to, according to both Lashonos of Rav Kahana, how are we going to interpret the Brisa that clearly, explicitly supports Rav? Well, Rav Kahana, meaning whether it's the first Lishna or the second Lishna, Hadasanya Ari, Shahoy Yisrael Mechta Torah Mechta Tmeim, Halolo Osim Liatza, Halolo Osim Liatzman, Heichi Mitaritzle. How is Rav Kahana going to explain this? Because Rav Kahana holds that if it's Mechta Mechta, then the Tmeim are not part of the Korban Pesach Rishon because he holds that Einam Karov, right? Mechta is not Karov. Rav Kahana Tanoi. At this point, he raises his hands, his back against the wall, and he's going to have to say, "It's a machlokas Tanoi." Ikad the Omar. There's one Tanu who holds Mechta Mechta Karov. Ikad the Omar Mechta Mechta Eino Karov. Just to finish up the Amud, the Gemara before had quoted a brisa that supported Rav, that in Mechta Mechta, each one of the two groups, the Tahorim and the Tmeim respectively, will bring their own korban. Ufa, let's go back to the brisa. Reisha ha Yisrael Mechta Torah Mechta Tmeim alolu osim liatzman alolu osim liatzman. But hayut meim otzim al tahorim afilu echad. So according to Tanakama, this Brisa, the first opinion holds that even if it's 51 against 50, this one extra tame is then yasu betuma lefisha ein carbon sibur chaluk. In other words, everyone should make one carbon. We want to bring in all Klal Yisrael. Remember, we had the Shita Rabbi Nosson that one lamb would suffice for all of Klal Yisrael. Rabbi Eliezer ben Masya Omer, Ein hayochid machrias hatzibur l'tuma. A majority of one is not enough. This reminds me of Masechta Sanhedrin. You know, the Gemara says that in Dinei Nefashos, you cannot condemn a person to die because you have one extra dayan. You need a majority of at least two. All right, that's nothing to do with this, but is Ein hayochid machrias hatzibur l'tuma shenemar, a pasuk in Dvarim Perek Tes Zayin, and here we turn to Daf Pei. We're in the Peis already. It's lo suchal lizboch es hapasach biachad shorech asher Hashem alkecha nosein loch. Now the word biachad is redundant, and therefore we're going to darshan the pasuk in the following way: lo suchal lizboch es hapesach biechad. You cannot shech the Pesach, meaning betuma, biechad. If you have one extra person, and the yachid is not going to tip the scale to change the din of shchitas haPesach and allow for a carbon Pesach b'tumah. Okay, then Rabosai, this is where we're going to stop for today. And the Mitzvah Hashem,